Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network Groong Week in Review. I'm Asbed Bedrossian, and we're recording this show on Monday, November 1st, 2021. Every now and then, it's good to step out of our local political scene and take a wider view on regional and global affairs. So this week, Hovik Manucharyan and I will take the following international topics in view. Georgia's runoff elections, Turkish drones in Donbas, Iran-Turkey tensions, and the G20 Palooza.
And for this, we're joined by Dr. Pietro Shakarian, who is a lecturer in history at the American University of Armenia in Yerevan. His research focuses on the history of Eastern Armenia and the Caucasus, especially Soviet Armenia during the era of Nikita Khrushchev's thaw. Hello and welcome back, Pietro, to our show. It's great to have you.
Hovik, it's great to be back, and Asbed, it's great to be back as well.
Hi, Pietro.
Hi, Badev.
Okay, on Saturday, October 30th, Georgia held runoff elections following the local municipal elections earlier in the month, on the 2nd of October, I believe. Early results showed that the ruling party, Georgian Dream, led by Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili, swept the runoffs. The opposition, United National Movement Party, led by Nika Melia, who lost the mayoral race in Tiflis, came up short despite the return and imprisonment of their former leader and former president Mikhail Saakashvili. Georgian Dream won the mayoral races in all 5 of the major cities: Tiflis, Batumi, Kutaisi, Poti, and Rustavi. Pietro, the Georgian Dream Party has a more balanced approach to regional geopolitics than the UNM, as they take a more nuanced approach to relations with Russia, Turkey, the West, China, and the regional players like Armenia and Azerbaijan. The UNM is more of a polarizingly pro-West party. What's your take on these election results?
Well, I think these election results are very good for Armenia. I think that it is a signal that Georgia is going to stay the course, that it is not going to fall under the revolutionary sway of Mikhail Saakashvili, who came back with this intention of fomenting a revolution. I mean, mass rallies in Tbilisi. You have members of the United National Movement Party in Georgia resigning their mandates from parliament. And you even have, actually, by the way, which is actually quite interesting, the United States is stepping in and criticizing the conduct of the election in terms of the way in which it was conducted by the Georgian Dream. But overall, it seems that this was a clean election and that the Georgian Dream won fair and square.
Yeah.
And that's actually very good news for Armenia because, the Georgian Dream Party is obviously, because it is not this kind of overtly pro-Western party, right? I mean, it still has that, European inclination, but it is not overtly pro-Western or destabilizingly pro-West as Mikhail Saakashvili and his party are.
Mm-hmm.
It is open to different forces in the region, as you've said, Asbed, so China, Russia, Iran, all these different regional players. So yeah, I mean, it is good news for Armenia that the Georgian Dream won these local elections.
So do you see Georgia's policy evolving towards Russia, for example? Is there any prospect for opening the borders for more economic activity, including between Russia and Armenia?
Well, I think, already this is something that the Georgian Dream has been focused on, opening borders, trade with Russia. This is actually one of their capstone achievements. As far as something more intensive, like the reopening of the Abkhaz Railway.
Specifically, I wanted to know about that. Thank you.
Well, that would really open up things for Armenia. And we know that this Georgian Dream Party and its backer, the man who is the main force behind this party, Bidzina Ivanishvili, he is personally supportive of reopening the Abkhaz Railway. But this idea has always been opposed exactly by the people who are now in the streets in Tbilisi, the UNM party, Mikhail Saakashvili, and they, even though they do not represent the wishes of the majority of Georgians, they have, collectively a big mouth, and they have a lot of political pressure, and they bring that to bear. So this party, the Georgian Dream Party, is going to try and walk it like a tightrope. And I'm not sure, unfortunately, we'll see much movement on the Abkhaz Railway, especially at this time. But I think in the long term, if they can get their house in order, I think that the Georgian dream can realize a project such as this, and it would be very beneficial for Armenia.
What do you think is going to happen with Saakashvili being in prison?
Well, now, I mean, he's been on hunger strike too. Don't forget that. I mean, and I think that he wants to kind of demonstrate himself as being like a martyr for the cause. But, these hunger strikes, they never last. I'm thinking, if we go back to Armenian politics, of course, hunger strikes, this is a well-tried formula. Rafi Hovhannisyan, is well known for his hunger strikes, and many others as well have engaged in hunger strikes.
It's a good way to lose weight.
It's a good way to lose weight, but I don't know if it's an effective, political instrument, and I think that it is not. I think that maybe Saakashvili will be losing a few pounds, but I don't think he will be able to regain the power that he seeks in Georgia.
I was looking at the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty coverage in the Georgian service, and almost 50% of their articles are about Saakashvili in jail ever since he got to jail. So somebody's very interested.
Somebody is very interested. In the U.S. Embassy, we saw they were quite interested in this election. So
Right.
We'll keep watching and see what happens. But I think the real Georgian people do not want this man to come back, because he has been a disaster for Georgia. I don't need to remind you about the 2008 war, but then also we have the prison scandal. We have when he blew up the World War II monument in Kutaisi, right? And
Yeah.
which resulted in the death of a child. He is like a reverse Midas. Everything he touches is a disaster. Like Odessa, like when he was in Ukraine, he went to Odessa, he was the governor there, he was going to kind of clean up shop, but that really didn't work out very successfully. I mean, for a while he was in Brooklyn, New York, I think. I don't know what he did there, but at least Brooklyn is still there. So we can be thankful for that.
Well, let's take a look at the conflict in Donbas, which seems to be heating up. So this past week, Ukraine's armed forces claimed that one of their soldiers was killed from a shelling by pro-Russian forces in eastern Donbas province. And following this, it was reported that Ukraine deployed one of the newly acquired Bayraktar TB2 drones that it had purchased from Turkey. And they claim to have destroyed a Russian howitzer artillery piece. The Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov expressed concern that the drones in the hands of the Ukraine military are a quote-unquote destabilizing factor. Pietro, we've talked about Turkey selling drones to as many countries as possible around Russia's borders. It seems to be, I wonder if they have a strategy or they're just trying to gain market share. But the drones seem to be like a ring of fire encircling Russia, spreading from Poland, Ukraine, on its western borders to Artsakh and Azerbaijan in the south, and to Tajikistan and Afghanistan in Central Asia. How does Kremlin soundly sleep under such circumstances? And does Russia have weapons to effectively counter this threat?
Well, okay, so there's a lot to kind of unpack here. I think that, first of all, if we talk about the strategy of Turkey, I think it corresponds exactly with the NATO plan of kind of encircling Russia. Right? So even though Turkey tries to establish itself as like a frenemy, sometimes partner, sometimes adversary of Russia, in this respect it is certainly acting in a very adversarial manner.
Right.
So that's point number one. Point number two, it was actually quite interesting because this week everybody here is familiar with RT, the Russian news outlet.
Russia Today, yeah.
So so Russia Today, they published an advertisement this week about a RT documentary about the S-70 Okhotnik drone. This drone has been, they've been testing it for a while, they've been working with it for a while, but it's actually interesting that they decided to put out this documentary now, or put out this information about it now, as if they're sending a signal to Ankara, as this information becomes known, I should say, that their Bayraktars are being used in Donbas to destroy Russian equipment and technology. So you have that. The other thing...
Is the Okhotnik drone sort of in the same category or class as the Bayraktar TB2?
It's a little bit more, it's more sophisticated, and we have to see it in combat. I mean, it's been tested and everything, but we have to see it, used in combat. So that's going to be interesting to see.
We have to mention Putin's comments at the Valdai Club, did you follow that actually? To give any hints about Russia's continuing policy on Ukraine in the coming months?
I mean, they are concerned about certainly the situation in Ukraine. There was a great article by Anatol Levin about this, about the different Russian attitudes toward Ukraine. There is one that is, a kind of a fearful attitude that they're going to restart hostilities, there's going to be a new kind of conflict there, or that also in addition, Russian language and culture would be destroyed irrevocably in Ukraine. That's another reason why there would be a kind of a fear. So there's the fear camp, but then there's also the camp that is the hopeful camp, I should say. This is like the Medvedev camp, where they're saying, look, Ukraine, they have such an unstable regime and such a bad economy and such serious political and economic problems that eventually they're going to see that this, adventure of Maidan and moving to the West and NATO and all that is not going to produce anything for the Ukrainian people, and at the right time they will turn back toward Moscow. And then there's also, some Russians who are just indifferent to the Ukrainian issue, but the majority of Russians, I can assure you, are very engaged.
Pietro, I've also heard that Putin has a lot of pressure on him to not be so conciliatory with Ukraine. They feel like Putin has been really soft on the Ukraine to preserve relationships with Germany, where he's got good relationships with Angela Merkel and such. So apparently, some people want them to just go straight through Ukraine and go to the borders of NATO and not stop anywhere inside Ukraine.
Oh, yeah. There are even different factions with regard to this. I mean, so, for instance, you have a hawkish faction in Russia that would like Putin to take Donbas, the complete Donbas. Already, there is the section that's held by the Donbas rebels, and then the section that's held by the Kiev, military.
Yeah, that's right.
But the idea would be that Putin would help the rebels regain the full territory of Donbas, right? So that's one scenario. But the other hawkish scenario in Russia is this idea that, look, we should take Kiev. We should go all the way to Kiev and take Kiev once and for all and end this whole episode once and for all.
End this madness.
Maybe even go all the way to the border with Poland, even. Mm-hmm. That we've had enough of this. Let's just go all the way to Kiev and end this show, right away. But what happened was during this, Ukrainian conflict that emerged in 2013 really is kind of this Maidan, and then you have the 2014 overthrow of the government in Ukraine, then you have the war in Donbas, and so on and so forth, the Russian intervention to support the rebels in Donbas. But it was not, to clarify, this is not like a full-scale Russian invasion, right? This is something that we hear a lot in the Western media, but it was not the case. Of course, there was the annexation of Crimea. That's a separate issue. Mm-hmm. Anyway, but, talking about this question of Ukraine, many in the Russian elite were, look, we will support the rebels in Donbas, but we are not interested in, going any further and destabilizing Ukraine. Just let Ukraine, learn hard lessons from this. Let the people of Ukraine see what this government really is, what this government actually does, that this government won't deliver anything for these people. That the reason why people went out in the streets in 2013 and 14 for the Maidan was because they were frustrated with corruption, they were frustrated with the socioeconomic situation in the country, and that this regime will not deliver anything. It will talk about nationalist platitudes of Ukraine. It will rehabilitate World War II collaborators with the Nazis.
Has that anger against corruption subsided a little bit?
Among the population, no.
Yeah.
And actually, the population, instead of actually really rising in revolt, I mean, the closest they came politically to expressing this frustration was when they elected Mr. Zelensky to the presidency of Ukraine. So to have kind of a populist guy, and who is a comedian, kind of an outsider, to be the president, that was one expression of the frustration. Plus, many in Ukraine were tired of this kind of nationalist discourse coming from Kiev, and they really were hoping that Mr. Zelensky would be the peace candidate. But Zelensky, his hands were tied because he had to deal with these nationalists in the Kiev government. And so there was only so much he could do. So as a result, Ukraine didn't really move anywhere. And now he's trying to posture himself as like, a nationalist in Ukraine. And it's not really working. It's not very successful. And I think at the end of the day, I think that this will express itself politically within Ukraine in the future in some other way. I think eventually it will result in the end of this Maidan-oriented government. But I think also many Ukrainians, unfortunately, are going to be voting with their feet. Many are just going to leave Ukraine. which is actually, that's part of the tragedy of Ukraine.
Pietro, you mentioned the Anatol Lieven article, which I read as well briefly, and if we're talking about the same article, and I believe that article said that in terms of NATO versus Russia, they seem to have an agreement on most areas that are concerned about regional security and not, red lines, with the exception of Ukraine. So do you think that this issue can be resolved? I mean, it seems to be like the ball is in NATO's court in terms of trying to figure out a formula with Russia that would help prevent new war from starting. What would you add to that or to respond to that?
I think NATO, this organization has been very pro-confrontation with Russia. As an organization, it has been very supportive of more kind of confrontational stance toward Russia.
Right.
But let's take it from the level of the U.S. government. If I were Mr. Biden, I would hire Anatol Lieven as an advisor, because Anatol Lieven he's a voice of reason. We need more people like that, because what Anatol Lieven would tell the president is, look, you don't have a dog in this fight in Ukraine. Don't arm the Ukrainians. Don't get involved in confronting Russia. It's a clear red line for Moscow. Central Asia is another clear red line for Moscow. The Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Artsakh, Azerbaijan, all these areas, this is a clear red line for Moscow. The Baltic states, which this is part of NATO, part of EU, there's always, you have periodically reports of kind of confrontation in the Baltic states on the Russian frontier with NATO. If I were Biden, I would hire somebody like Anatol Lieven to advise him to dial down the confrontation, right? And I think that that's what a reasonable American president, doesn't have to be Biden, it can be any American president. I would advise him or her to bring in somebody like Anatol Lieven.
So that's what I wanted to ask. If that logic that you're saying should prevail, how do we explain the continued honeymoon between Russia and Turkey? We're seeing the alliance across the Black Sea sort of strengthening. We're seeing Ukraine applying as an observer to the Turkic Council. Where does this make sense in the global calculus of regional security and alliances?
The Russians, they know what they're doing. Right, they're playing a very kind of strategic game, and there is, of course, the view that Turkey is kind of like a frenemy. But also, Moscow increasingly is waking up to the reality that Turkey is more adversary than it is, friend or partner. And this case of Ukraine is a clear-cut demonstration of that. Now, in terms of this discussion about opening corridors and all that, if I were Russia, I would be very wary about opening up all sorts of corridors that might lead to more Turkish inroads in the Caucasus. Because in reality, as we know, Hovik, Turkey at the end of the day is still a member of NATO. And if Turkey expands its influence in the Caucasus, this is a case of NATO expanding its influence in the Caucasus. So if you have, Russian politicians who are saying, oh yes, let's open up the door, why not, come on in. It's almost like, Tigran the Great. He brought to Tigranakert, this is kind of the old Armenian history, but he brought to Tigranakert, Greeks, from all over the classical world to move to Tigranakert, this great capital city he built. And then what happened is the Romans attacked his Armenian Empire, and they went to Tigranakert, and what do you think happened? The Greeks opened the door, and the Romans walked right in. And this could be a similar case. If the Russians open the door, Turkey can walk right in, and then suddenly it has NATO right there on its borders with Dagestan, with Chechnya, with all these republics.
All the way to Central Asia.
Exactly. And so the Russians, and given that perspective, that strategic perspective, if we talk to somebody like Shoigu, if we talk to the Siloviks in Russia, I'm sure that they would not be in favor of a scenario such as that. Now, that being said, the Russians are also deferring a lot of agency and autonomy to the Armenian government. So it is partially at the behest of the Armenian government to indicate to Russia the seriousness of the situation. And that, I think, is where we have a serious problem, that the Armenian government, again, is not there.
Yeah.
So it is what it is.
Okay, let's move to our next topic about Iran and Turkey tensions. Since the 44-day war in Artsakh, Iran has lost significant influence and leverage in the Caucasus. While its stated policy was that Armenia should return territories adjacent to Artsakh back to Azerbaijan and find a peaceful resolution, Iran was quite happy with the status quo because so much of the Azerbaijani border with Iran was under Armenian control and out of reach for Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Israel to use against Iran. That has all changed, seeing that Armenia has not defended its interests in Artsakh and has now even allowed Azerbaijan to encroach on its territory and threaten to block Iran from Armenia. Iran has found itself needing to respond to Aliyev's provocations and Turkey's expanding sphere of influence in the region. Thinking about all this, Pietro, what are the key geopolitical interests that Iran must defend on its northern borders? I mean, we know it has already specified certain red lines and everything, but what are the key, what's the bottom line for them?
I think the bottom line for Iran is very similar to Russia, and I think that they have to. If I were the Iranian government, I would coordinate with Russia on this, and I think that they already are. That to see an expanded Turkish influence in the Caucasus would be catastrophic. And I think that this is where the corridor issue comes into play. This is not just an issue because we tend to look at it from the perspective of just Armenia.
Yeah.
And, maybe, Turkish goods going through Mekri, going through the south there in Sunik. But this is also a matter of concern for Iran and a matter of concern for Russia. And I think Iran especially is concerned that this corridor, even if it's guarded by Russian troops, even if you have Russian forces there, that Turkey could use it nevertheless to gain a foothold in the region. And then Iran is in a very serious situation. The Iranian government also, so you guys know Yehia Tashjan?
That's right. Yes.
Who is okay? So he actually was discussing this with some Iranian officials. He actually interviewed them. I talked to him recently about this. So
he had a great article which was published in the Armenian Weekly recently, I think. We will link to that in the document.
Yes, and so he actually was talking about how Iranian officials were just as critical. I mean, they were just as of course they were critical of Aliyev, and they were critical of Turkey, but they were just as critical of Armenia, that they felt the Armenian government wasn't there. And we come back to this question: where is Yerevan? It shows you actually that when we talk about this question, I mean, this is actually really interesting that we're doing a whole show on the whole geopolitical setting without Armenia, because it shows you how Armenia, as a result of this, war in Artsakh-Karabakh, has become more of an object of international relations and less of a subject.
Yeah.
And when it was a subject, it could be it could help determine some of the developments.
It would be
in
at the
region.
table of the discussions.
And you had a government that was. It would be at the table of the discussions. And so now you have a government that, for whatever reason, is not at the table of the discussions. It is not even taking an active effort to be at the table. So this is what actually Iranian officials, they were complaining. So this is another serious situation as well too. Iran is also very concerned, especially if we talk about a few years ago, and actually this is very recent memory. So this is very fresh in the Iranian minds. That when we had George W. Bush as the president of the United States, there were a lot of war hawks and neocons in the Bush administration who were advocating war with Iran, and they were also even advocating, in some instances, partition of Iran, including the break-off of northern Iran, Iranian Azerbaijan, with to be unified with the Republic of Azerbaijan.
Right.
And even though the U.S., the war hawks even have not made concrete steps in this direction, Aliyev nevertheless has played up to this. He has been trying to kind of encourage, through his own kind of soft power, kind of a Azerbaijani movement in northern Iran. And so for Tehran, this is a very serious situation that, Azerbaijan, in addition to everything else it's doing, is also acting as a destabilizer of its territorial integrity. That's actually the irony, of course. I just want to say this, Asbed. The irony is that Azerbaijan is always talking about territorial integrity, but when it comes to territorial integrity of Iran, this is a separate question. All bets are off now.
Right.
Suddenly that they're, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. It's always like that. What are the main causes of tension between Iran and Turkey? These two very large countries, right next to the South Caucasus. What are they frictioning about? These two countries.
Well, there are many different areas, theaters of tension. I think that one is, of course, the Caucasus itself. If Turkey becomes the dominant force in the Caucasus, Iran perceives that as a weakening of its influence. So, for instance, this recent war in Artsakh-Karabakh was seen, as you guys said, as being kind of a blow to Iranian,
Right.
strength in the region, right?
But is it a zero-sum game between these two countries? Are they viewing everything
Um,
as a zero-sum game?
Well, no, there are negotiations. There is room for negotiations. I mean, also in addition to this, Asbed, you have to consider Syria. You have to consider the greater Middle Eastern conflicts that
Right.
exist between Turkey
Israel.
and Iran. There's also Israel. There is a historical relationship of antagonism between Turkey and Iran that goes back several centuries, but also, histories of good relations too. So this relationship goes back and forth. There's actually periods of peace, there's periods of conflict, and it goes back and forth. So Tehran, has dealt diplomatically with Ankara, and they will continue to do so. But in some cases, there are red lines Iran has, and that
Right.
Iran will not allow Turkey to cross. So the Caucasus actually, I believe, is one of those red lines. It would not favor a scenario where Turkey is the dominant player in the
Okay.
Caucasus.
All right.
And we recently had a podcast about this with Varujan Geramian. My takeaway from that, if this is not a zero-sum game, it is a very high-stakes game at the minimum,
Yes.
where there's competition between east-west versus north-south trade routes or north-west trade routes. Specifically, we're talking about energy exports and in general, like shipping and communications from China, India, through Iran, through Armenia to Europe. And it seems, at least according to Varujan Geramian, that the attempts for Turkey to project its force in Caucasus are meant to help, create a buffer against that and force a east-west communication route, in which case Azerbaijan would win, Turkey would win, and Russia would also win because the control of the gas pipelines, there's fewer players in that market. I don't know if Russia is directly a participant in this. I
Well,
didn't mean to imply that, but at least for Turkey and Azerbaijan, they are.
I think Varujan, is partially correct. It is extremely high stakes game for Iran to play, but it's not just about trade routes and energy pipelines. I mean, for them, it's also a matter of security because I highlighted again this issue of Iranian Azerbaijan. That's a very very serious question for them, right? Iranian Azerbaijan actually is extremely integrated with Iran, culturally, historically, politically. So it's not something that they have to worry about actively, but it is a concern that you have a player in the region, Azerbaijan, that is trying to kind of foment some discord in Iran,
and possibly
some
destabilize Iran
nationalist discord,
itself.
and destabilize. Also, I would push back on the idea that the east-west corridors, that this is actually beneficial for Russia because Russia has had a very strong record, very consistent record of opposing these Western-backed energy projects that go from west to east, east to west. It
Yeah.
is firmly committed to the north-south, the north-south trajectory.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
mean, you have to. I mean, if somebody who says that this is that Russia is interested in the west-east or east-west corridors, that it favors that, has not been looking at American analysis of Russia. I mean, from the side of American war hawks over the past 20 years. Because the past 20 years, if you look at something like Foreign Affairs, they had an article in the mid 2000s called Integrating Europe's East, for example, which was all about actually kind of bringing in, integrating really the South Caucasus region, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, into the kind of Euro-Atlantic structures to kind of shore up those pipeline connections and to create an alternative energy route that bypasses Russia. Because also you have to think that connection, they could extend that to Central Asia. And Central Asia, you have to think, Turkmenistan has major reserves of natural gas. Kazakhstan has major reserves of oil. These are energy-rich countries. And so the idea was to kind of play a new great game in Central Asia, and to use Turkey as kind of the means of accessing that. So that is still very much an issue for Russia, because if the West gets in through the door through Turkey and gets a corridor from the Caucasus into Central Asia, then that would really disrupt, Russian influence and Russia's position in a good chunk of its post-Soviet space.
I've
So
also read some
that's why.
analysis that indicates that Turkmenistan's gas reserves are specifically targeted. In fact, there was a recent agreement to drop all disagreements between Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan over the Caspian and start exporting Turkmenistan's gas via Turkey if possible. So that's going to be
Yes.
something not only that Russia doesn't like, but also Iran, because Iran is the one who wants to put out a lot of gas north-south.
And actually, Asbed, the fact that you raised this, the fact that that's a news item now, if I were Moscow, I would be extremely alarmed by that.
Absolutely.
That they've been able to, that now Turkey has, riding on on the war horse of Artsakh, has been able to now push in to Central Asia. That now they're having Azerbaijan, both Turkey and Azerbaijan are working out deals to get that energy, to kind of realize the alternative energy pipeline that would make Russia less geopolitically relevant.
Right.
Right? So this is a very serious question for Russia. And also Iran. Both of those, Russia and Iran, are not interested in this at all.
Yeah.
I would say both of them.
Part of the effort on this one is to reduce Europe's dependence on Russia for its energy reserves. So this is not something that Russia wants at all.
And also think what that would imply too, because politically it
Loss
would
of
mean
influence,
that it would mean loss of influence also in places like Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So potentially we could be looking at a scenario where Russia could be losing everything.
Let's move on to the next topic, the G20 Palooza. After nearly 2 years of reprieve in physical meetings, the leaders of the G20 countries, the top 20 economies of the world, met in Rome starting on Friday. Leaders from China, Russia, Mexico, and Japan attended remotely. The main topics evolved around climate change, international minimum business tax deal, the pandemic, and the global economic recovery from the pandemic. The Iran nuclear deal, JCPOA, was also a topic among US and EU leaders, as were China's rise on international scene and Russia, specifically as in the context of Russia versus the West. On the sidelines, there were many other meetings of note. Let's just mention a couple of them. Biden met with Erdogan, main topics around human rights, the F-16 deal, and other military deals. And also, Artsakh issue was supposed to be on the agenda. Putin attended remotely, but Putin and Johnson discussed at JCPOA, Boris Johnson from the UK. Biden spoke with Lavrov. There were essentially US-Russia discussions, and there was further interest to strengthen those contacts. And also, Çavuşoğlu and Lavrov were scheduled to discuss the 3+3 deal, which seems to still be on the agenda of some countries. Pietro, what are your impressions of the summit?
I think the summit is, again, kind of a means for kind of, especially if we're talking about, Russia in the West, and also, China in the West. I mean, this is a way to kind of touch base on some issues, to kind of establish some points of common interest. So this meeting on the sidelines between Lavrov and Biden actually was quite good, because Biden actually stressed that he would be interested in meeting Putin for kind of a more intensive one-on-one meeting, which is a good thing. It's a good foundation for something. The discussions between Putin and Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, over the Iran deal, they're also quite promising as well, too. It shows that there is an effort, that there is a sort of a seriousness on the part of the West to kind of renew this deal, that it would be a stabilizing factor.
Yeah, on that nuclear deal, did I catch a headline where the U.S. seemed to imply that they have different ideas than what the UK and Russia were discussing in terms of the Iran nuclear deal? Do you know if there's any disagreement between NATO partners on the JCPOA discussions with Russia?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me, because we had that issue with France recently, between France and the U.S. So I think that there is some disagreement. In part, also, you have to think that the U.S. position on the Iran deal under Trump, now they're trying to look for a way to kind of put some of the pieces back together. The other consideration we have to think about is Iran itself. How would Iran accept the deal as it was, at the time that it was scrapped, at the time that the United States rejected it. And I'm not sure, especially with a more conservative government going in, that this might be the case.
About the JCPOA, the only thing that I've seen is that the United States wants Iran to come back to the table, and I don't think that they want Iran to change any of the terms, and they're just not sure if Iran's going to try and renegotiate or what to come
That I
back.
think, yeah, that I think, Asbed, I think that's the big issue,
Yeah.
is would Iran come back to the deal as it was before? And we have to wait and see.
Okay.
We have to see how that develops. Well, there was also something else kind of related to G20 in a way, that Biden recently was declaring the Summit for Democracies. This was one of the big things he was going to launch, a Summit for Democracies in December. So next month already, a summit for democracies of the world. And actually, Lavrov was quite critical of this idea. He recently was interviewed about it, and he said that, it would be interesting to see who's invited and who is not. The sum of democracy pursues the aim of classifying people and countries into democratic and undemocratic ones. The way I see it, the Americans wish to achieve the maximum loyalty to create an impression there is a mass Washington-led movement. And of course, both China and Russia were not invited to this democracy summit. So I don't know if this is going to contribute to anything positive in U.S.-Russian relations.
Yeah.
And also it shows that there's kind of like a split personality that probably if you're watching this from Moscow, there's some confusion because at one point you have the U.S. president agreeing to more contacts with Russia. He wants to meet with Putin. But on the other hand, he's hosting this summit for democracies. And so you have kind of like you have like mixed messaging going on here. And I think that's maybe somebody I don't think that they were this clever, but maybe somebody in the White House staff was thinking along the lines of, maybe we should channel Teddy Roosevelt and have speak softly but have a big stick kind of a thing. But I really don't think that is the strategy here. Yeah, and also the other thing I think this is done for is I think it's purely PR, in the sense that I think that Biden is trying to demonstrate to the world, look, America is back. America is ready to lead the world. But the problem with this is I don't think the world is ready to let America lead it. And I think that all of these countries in the world, I mean, we just saw even within the Western alliance, we see France, it wants to go its own way.
Yeah.
It wants to pursue its own deals. It doesn't want to be told what to do by some other country. And even in the United States itself, you have majorities in both parties that are tired of these forever wars. They don't want they want to see America, involved on the international stage, but not in the way that many elites in Washington conceive that America should be involved. So I think that this is a bunch of platitudes, it's a bunch of PR, but I don't think it will result in anything tangible. I think that the hope of Biden is maybe to strengthen the Western alliance through a summit like this. Maybe that's too charitable an assessment, but I think this is not going to be very productive, especially when we talk about East-West relations. And by East-West, I mean U.S. on one side and Russia and China on the other side. So let's wait and see how it all turns out. But I think that a lot of interesting moves are being made, and we shall see. I mean, we're in an age of great powers and old games, so to speak. I mean, we have the geopolitical chess game continues. Let's see how this all shakes out.
Okay. Before we end the show, I just want to see if either one of you gentlemen has a personal topic that you would like to talk about today.
Oh, me.
Hovik, go ahead. Hovik has his hand raised.
I have a lot of topics I can rant about, believe me, but this one is very rant-worthy right now. Today, November 1st, was the day when Armenia was supposed to tighten its regulations around wearing masks in public spaces. Needless to say, I have seen no masks being worn out of the ordinary. It just sort of, if the purpose is to have just words, then, out there, then Armenia is doing a good job. But my advice to the Armenian government would be to, if you're going to be able to apply policies, to pass laws or regulations only in cases where it's able to execute and enforce them, because otherwise it creates a lot of distrust in other areas of your policies. So, yeah, that's my short rant.
Okay, Pietro, do you have a personal statement that you would like to make?
I have a rant too, as a matter of fact, and it's related to COVID. So recently, you know what I read? I read that only 7% of Armenia is vaccinated.
That's right.
7%. Oh my gosh. Now Russia, I believe it's like 30%, if I'm not mistaken. And Georgia and Azerbaijan, it's similar percentages. But yet Armenia is only 7%. And that, to me, that is an indication. It's not something uniquely Armenian about this figure. There's not something in the Armenian soul that makes only 7% of Armenians want to take the vaccine. I think that this is a failing of the Armenian government, a very serious failing of the Armenian government, and goes back to really the start of the COVID pandemic. Now, apologists for the current government would tell me, when you had the prime minister going out campaigning in the middle of a pandemic for some political cause, that, okay, look, everybody handled the pandemic bad. Even Trump handled the pandemic bad. So it's okay, if he maybe made a mistake. I don't think it's a mere mistake if Armenia was the worst affected post-Soviet country in terms of COVID. That was really, really, I think, a case of gross negligence and mismanagement on the part of this government. And I think that what you see, the response is very crisis-oriented. As you guys mentioned at the top of the hour, at the top of the show, that I'm a lecturer at the American University of Armenia. I was shocked when I came in to find out the majority of my students, when I started classes, were not vaccinated. Especially coming from the United States, to see that. Now we have a case where there's an upsurge in cases all of a sudden. Even in Russia, where you have a higher percentage of vaccinated population, they have a new surge in cases. They had Moscow go on a partial lockdown this past week, now followed by St. Petersburg and the rest of the country. So Armenia, I feel, again, I'm not seeing a very kind of competent response to this crisis.
I mean, despite what your political viewpoint is, it's very clear. And when you have the Minister of Health, who doesn't, by the way, have a degree in health policy or health, medicals, any medical degree. When she's out there, like
Hovik, that's very, very reassuring. Thank you for letting me know that.
There is no sympathy lost on me on this government, but the facts speak for themselves. They don't want to take COVID seriously. I don't know of any other explanation for this.
All right, we're going to leave it there today. Thank you, Pietro. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, Asbed, and thank you, Hovik. It was a wonderful discussion.
All right, thanks.
I appreciate it.
Okay, that was our weekend review show, and we hope it helped you catch up with some of the issues in and around Armenia from this past week. As always, we invite your feedback and your suggestions. You can find us on most social media and podcast platforms or our website, groong.org. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on YouTube, like our pages, and follow us on social media. On behalf of everyone in this episode, we wish you a good week. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.